Ukraine clearly understands Russia's psychological weakness. They're holding them, they're fixing them in place. As the edges of the cauldron close in, they will withdraw. This does not necessarily mean a defeat. If you're relying on North Korea to supply 70% of your ammunition, you're not doing something right. Ukraine's continued attacks against the Russian oil infrastructure is having an increasing impact on the Russian economy. While the battle for Pokrovsk rages on and everyone is trying to second guess what is happening in the corridors of power in Moscow, we will take a closer look at the front line and at what will happen next for Ukraine. Does it have the strength to keep the Russian forces at bay for another 18 months? How will its strategy change and adapt to its biggest loss of land in years, if or when Pokrovsk falls? But this is not necessarily a bad thing. How will the weather influence the battlefield? And what new weapons are coming online to shape the outcome of the war? This is Battle Plans Exposed. But first, let's have a look at what's going on the front lines. This is footage of 2 Russian soldiers hiding in a building at Pokrovsk and whilst being hunted down by Ukrainian FPV drones. The first 2 drones hit the building entrance, whilst the 3rd drone hits one of the Russian infantrymen, severely wounding him in his leg. This shows that hiding in buildings, hiding in trenches, does not make you immune to modern weapons on the battlefield, especially these FPV drones. Next, we have the results of the fog of war being lifted. But this isn't the fog caused by war, this is the fog caused by the weather. The Russians started to advance along this road whilst it was covered in a thick, dense covering of fog, hiding the Russian advances. But then the wind came in, and in a puff of wind, the Russian troops were exposed. All we can see here now are the destroyed vehicles, because Ukrainian FPV drones could then be used to good effect. But in the corridors of power in Moscow, there's always speculation around Putin's health, Putin's hands, and plastic surgery, whether Putin has had it. Of course, we're assuming that this is Vladimir Putin himself and not his first body double, his second body double, or his third body double. But we have to remember that he's in his late 70s now. It's always the hands or the neck that gives away those that have had various treatments. And here we have the Shahad drones being knocked down. If you watch our last episode, you can see the Ukrainian technology that's allowing this. They're being attacked from underneath, almost certainly by the new Ukrainian anti-drone drones. And of course, this is showing the vulnerability of the slow-moving, low-flying Shahad drones from Ukraine's innovative anti-drone drones. So let's look at Pokrovsk. Putin is losing his objectivity on Pokrovsk. It's a pressure valve for him rather than a city with strategic importance. For the Ukrainians, it's a choke point. For the Russians, it's a political need. Ukraine is exploiting this need from Putin. His attachment to Pokrovsk is no longer as an objective of real military value. It was seen beforehand as having real strategic value with its lines of communication that went right across to Zaporizhia, the rail lines, the road lines and everything else, the intersection. But it's no longer that. Its military value has disappeared. But to the Russians, it's an emotional value. It's an emotional game. So let's wargame what could happen if, or more likely when, Pokrovsk does fall. And putting it into context, Ukraine has effectively, for the last 18 months, fixed the Russians in Pokrovsk. But it's done that in a number of towns and cities since the war started. First of all, we had Mariupol. Then we had Bakhmut. Over a year of holding the Russians in Bakhmut, the Russians throwing everything at trying to push the Ukrainians out of Bakhmut. And then when Bakhmut fell, it then moved to Pokrovsk. Russia doesn't seem to learn. Ukraine clearly understands Russia's psychological weakness. That is, its fixation at all costs and at huge costs on towns and cities. Once Ukraine feels that they'll be overwhelmed as the edges of the cauldron close in and it becomes impossible for them to supply the troops logistically, they will withdraw. Now, this does not necessarily mean a defeat. A withdrawal is a deliberate military operation, but Russia will define it as a defeat. If we look at what's happened since the start of the war, and we're coming up to almost 4 years, it will be 4 years in February next year, Russia has advanced a few tens of kilometers inside Ukrainian territory in the east. If we compare that to Russian advances over a similar period of time during the Second World War, over that similar period of time, they were knocking on the doors of Berlin. Their advances were measured in hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers. Does this suggest that the Russians are having success in Ukraine? They had massive success in Nazi Germany. A snail seems to be moving faster in Ukraine. And if we look at the latest UK Defence Intelligence assessments of how long it would take the Russians to capture the whole of the Donbass region that Vladimir Putin is trying to force Ukraine to give up as part of any peace negotiation, UK Defence Intelligence has said 4 years at current rates of advance and another 2 million casualties. But that's not stopping Vladimir Putin in his thinking. The psychological impact of Pokrovsk and the way it has fixed his troops for the last 18 months is something that he is now fixated on. He needs a win that he can then go into the winter months and sell to the people of Russia that he is advancing, to try and use that to undermine the will of the people of Ukraine to continue to support the operation, and to try and suggest to Donald Trump and to the West that he's winning. Will it happen? Well, let's look at what the next line of defense for Ukraine would be. Let's theorize that the next defense will be based around Dobropilya. Now, I've chosen it not because this is what Ukrainian battle plans have told me, but because it's the next urban conurbation and it allows me to theorize about how defense will be along that line. And of course, it could become the next point where the Russians become fixed, the next Mariupol, the next Bakhmut, the next Pokrovsk. And if it holds the Russians up for another 12 months, another 18 months, another 2 years, then that is the Ukrainians having success in their defensive operations. Let's look at this from the principles of defense perspective, the theory behind defense. And here I'm taking the US theory. There's subtle changes between how the US look at things, how the UK looks at things, and how NATO looks at things, but arguably they're all the same. Allied Doctrine Publication 3-90, the US publication looking at defense, describes the principles of defense as disruption, vulnerability, maneuver, mass and concentration, operation in depth, preparation and security. So taking that from a reverse perspective, security. I don't know what the Ukrainian defensive plans are next. They're not out in the public domain. They're not being widely discussed. Ukraine is keeping its operational security around this very, very close hold. Just right, as it should do. Preparation. Ukraine will be preparing and has prepared defensive lines the whole way through the rest of the areas of the Donbass that Russia has not captured. We know that because we have heard of the Russians talking of it, we've heard of the Ukrainians talking of it, and we've seen the movement of large earth-moving capabilities. And we know those defensive lines will be built in a way to concentrate the Russian forces, but to allow the Ukrainians to concentrate their defense. We know they will consist of anti-tank ditches, of minefields, of anti-tank traps, the dragon's teeth, as we see, of things that will slow the infantry down, barbed wire, anti-personnel mines. And we know that that will have an overwatch by FPV drones, artillery, rockets and tanks. More of that in a moment. But mass and concentration, trying to break up any ability for Russia to concentrate and attack through, but been able to allow the Ukrainians to maintain a concentration of reserve forces should they need to come and plug any gaps or exploit any opportunities in punching through and pushing the Russians back. That's in there. Manoeuvre is part of that. And of course, having your forces that can manoeuvre is something that we have seen the Ukrainians display beforehand to the north of Pokrovsk whenever the Russians managed to advance tens of kilometers into Ukrainian-held territory. The Ukrainian corps structure with the Azov Corps pushed a brigade forward to encircle the Russians and to push them back. So with manoeuvre from a Russian perspective, the Russians have got a different view of manoeuvre. It's not about manoeuvring armoured capability. They use their drones to manoeuvre in the air. They use their fixed-wing aircraft to enable the manoeuvre of troops on the ground by using glide bombs, as we've discussed beforehand. But Russian manoeuvre is down to small groups of individuals, poorly trained, poorly disciplined, and not really knowing what they're doing. But they go on foot, they go on motorbikes, they go on bicycles, they use any vehicle that they can find. We've even seen them using civilian cars that they've cut the doors off and the sides off to stand in and pack troops into to go along roads. They become fixated with roads. They become fixated with having to walk to different locations. When the front line can be over a 10 to 15 kilometre depth, because that's the depth that Ukrainians can influence it with their FPV drones, and the Russians can influence with their FPV drones. Walking that whilst under fire, whilst under the threat of drones, in combat conditions, with poor equipment, is not something that happens quickly. Flexibility. The flexibility comes in the mindset, the command and control, the way that troops have got an understanding of what it is that they're supposed to be doing and why they're doing it. The Russians don't have that flexibility, the Ukrainians have. And disruption. It's disrupting any Russian attack in a way that it can be forced to stall. It can be not just stalled and stopped, but it can be dealt with in a way that the Russians need to then fire another wave to attack and another wave to attack. And we've seen that in Pokrovsk, we saw that in Bakhmut, we saw that in Mariupol. Wave after wave becomes a meat grinder from a Russian perspective. Ukrainians exploit that. It's buying time, trading space for time. So one of the other factors that comes into any military operation, but defensive operations in particular, is weather. It dictates everything. Russia, as we've seen, was trying to use the fog, but not the fog of war, the fog of weather, to maneuver along some of the roads to attack in with armoured forces. Once the wind blows and the weather pushes the fog away, that allows the Ukrainians to use their FPV drones to good effect. But weather has always been a factor. I remember in Bosnia that American military planners forgot to look at the floodplains of the River Sava as they were moving the US troops for one US armoured division into the north of Bosnia from Croatia. It was an operation that should have taken days, but the river was in flood. They didn't have enough bridging equipment, and that operation that should have taken days took weeks. In reality, it took months. Weather is tied to terrain. That river between Croatia and Bosnia was the terrain. You get your assessment of the weather wrong, you get your military operations wrong. Once you concentrate an enemy into a particular area, it's very easy to make an impact on the enemy. And that is the next critical bit. Defensive lines are designed to push the enemy into killing zones, as they're commonly known. Concentrate them into a place where you can have that military effect on them. And of course, the Ukrainians are using a lot of the Western equipment that we have to good effect. And this is done by overwatch from the likes of the British Challenger 2 tank, by interdiction by the likes of the US-supplied Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, but anti-tank missiles, the TOW anti-tank missile, but also overwatch from the FPV drones, from mortars, from artillery, and the troops in trenches. But the thing that dictates how you carry out those defensive operations, how you can maneuver, again, is back to the weather. And if we look at from Pokrovsk up to further defensive lines, the ground can become very soft. Ukrainian mud sucks. It sucks armoured vehicles and any vehicle into the mud, which is why the Russians are fixated on sticking to the tracks and to the roads. The Ukrainians know that, and they can further push and concentrate the Russians on those tracks and roads and make sure that they're properly defended through mines and through direct fire weapons and everything else. Russia's resorting to small cars and motorbikes. Military equipment is not as maneuverable as these motorbikes, quad bikes, small cars, or Shanks's pony, i.e. on foot. And of course in the weather we've got the wet and the mud and the land and the ground. But in the winter in Ukraine, we've got up to minus 30 degrees. Ukrainian troops are provided with Western clothing, with warm weather gear to be able to survive through the winter. We know from reporting and from what Russian prisoners of war have said, they're not. Food is also critical. The Russians are not getting food supplies to the front lines. The Ukrainians are getting fairly well fed by comparison. One affects morale from a positive perspective, the other affects morale from a negative perspective. It's not easy to fight when it's minus 30, you're freezing cold, you're soaking wet through, you haven't been fed for days. It's much easier to defend whenever you're in warm clothing, you know that you've got a hot meal or a hot drink, and you're feeling more comfortable. But there's no point in creating the delay unless you're going to do something about it. And this is where we need to lift our sights up and look at the operational level. At the operational level, pressures on the Russian economy and the rest of Russia is growing. Ukraine's continued attacks against the Russian oil infrastructure, against its defense manufacturing capability, is having an increasing impact on the Russian economy. It's having an increasing impact on Russia's ability to manufacture its own equipment to support its operations in Ukraine. So with the Russian economy creaking, what are the indicators? Well, recent reports are saying that Russia is relying on 70% of its ammunition, in particular its artillery ammunition, coming from North Korea. Russian tank manufacturers are laying off 10% of the workforce. So, whilst Russia is being bled dry, Ukraine is continuing to withdraw very slowly in the front lines. It's fixing the Russians psychologically, it's fixing them militarily. But Ukraine is using that time to try and have a further effect on Russia. It's banking that something inside Russia will break, and therefore it's attacking Russia's ability to continue to support the tactical operations in the front line by attacking Russia's ability to manufacture military material that's needed to get to the front line, by attacking the logistic infrastructure that's needed to get that material to the front line, by forcing Russia to rely on North Korea. Would anyone consider Russia relying on North Korea as being a good thing? But most of all, trying to break the Russian economy, to force Russia into a position where it is going to be increasingly difficult for continue to finance the war. And of course, pressure is then being enhanced by what the West is doing and the discussion of releasing the Russian frozen assets that are being held inside Belgium so that they can pay for further weapons purchases by Europe and NATO and Ukraine from the United States and elsewhere. Russia sees this as a threat, and that is why we're seeing Belgian airports being closed by drones coming from Russia, drones over critical national infrastructure in Germany, in Denmark, over military airfields in Sweden and elsewhere. The Russians are worried. So, and finally, let's take a look at some equipment. You heard me talk about the American M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle with its 25mm Bushmaster chain gun. A piece of equipment that is not in Ukraine, but is something that is in the press in the UK at the moment, is the latest armoured reconnaissance vehicle for the British Army, the Ajax, with a 40mm caseless cannon. They look very similar. The Bradley has been around for decades. The Ajax is a brand new vehicle. The electronics and the design inside and the design of the weapon system is significantly better than what the Bradley's got. The Bradley is one of Ukraine's military's favourite weapon systems. But then, of course, the other weapon system that the Ukrainian military love, they call it the sniper of all tanks, is the Challenger 2. The Challenger 2, with its 120mm rifled gun, its accuracy is phenomenal. And they use it as a sniper weapon rather than for its manoeuvre capability, because it's heavy. Ukrainian mud sucks and it gets stuck, but it can destroy Russian tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armoured vehicles and soft-skinned vehicles at a huge range. And it's that sort of piece of equipment that will provide that overwatch to any defensive positions that Ukraine has developed. Of course, there's another difference between these three vehicles, and this is something that all British military personnel who've worked in armoured vehicles will understand. The Ajax and the Challenger have got a special piece of equipment called the BV, the boiling vessel. It allows them to make cups of tea. So important for morale whenever you're fighting in the front line. The Americans are jealous. So we've seen on occasions beforehand a video of the Bradley being used to good effect in Ukraine against a Russian T-72 tank. That 25mm cannon, the ammunition in it, they're like big bullets. It can penetrate the side armour or the top armour of a main battle tank, a Russian main battle tank. It can't penetrate the frontal armour, but it can destroy all of the optics and it can destroy its ability to fight. And of course, you can use it to blow the tracks off. The Bradley won the fight with the T-72. The 40mm cannon that comes with the Ajax is a step change better. Its ammunition can be programmed to airburst over a target. It has got anti-armour capability on it. It's got other different natures of ammunition, but more importantly, it doesn't look like a big bullet. The propellant is around the object that you're trying to fire out. It's called caseless ammunition. It doesn't have a brass case. It means that the ammunition is smaller and lighter and you can fit more into the system even though it is a larger caliber and therefore can have a greater effect. The optics and electronics on the Ajax are significantly better than on the Bradley. And therefore this, whenever they get it right and get it properly in service, could be and will likely be a phenomenal piece of equipment. And of course the Challenger 2 is being upgraded to the Challenger 3. Unfortunately for the British Army, only 148 of them. The big change is effectively a new turret. The new turret, because they're replacing the 120mm rifled barrel with a NATO standard 120mm smoothbore barrel. That makes the interchangeability of the ammunition between NATO tanks much better. But it's also being linked to much better fire control systems to make it even more accurate over a longer range. If the Ukrainians see it as the sniper of all tanks now, just think of the phenomenal ability that the Challenger 3 is going to have on any battlefield. And on the Ajax in particular, if you want to find out any more detailed information, Jerome Starkey, the defence editor with The Sun, has been down to see it and has been allowed to play with it. Check out his video on that. So, will Pokrovsk fall? I think it probably will. Will the Ukrainians be ready for the next battle? I think they understand the Russians. They've shown that for the last 4 years. They have stopped the Russians from advancing as quickly as they did against Nazi Germany during the Second World War. They're holding them, they're fixing them in place. They see that Russia becomes fixated on towns. So the next Ukrainian defensive battle is likely to be around another town. And we can see that Ukraine is using the time that they're given by holding the Russians, by fixing them that place for good effect, because they're using it to attack at the operational level. As I said earlier, if you're relying on North Korea to supply 70% of your ammunition, you're not doing something right, and that does not bode well. And of course, the pressures on the Russian economy are such that they're only going to get worse and worse. And we're seeing that in the increase of the disinformation campaign and the grey zone warfare that Russia is, we believe, carrying out across Europe with its drones and other things. So that's all for Battle Plans Exposed today. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, please hit like, please put your comments and questions underneath. If there's anything you want us to cover, put it in there and we'll sit down and have a look at that for you. But thank you for watching today. Goodbye.